Deep in the Maros Pangkep karst region of the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, in a limestone cave that requires a difficult scramble to access, there is a painting of a warty pig, rendered in reddish-brown pigment, that has been dated to at least 45,500 years old. It is, as far as current evidence indicates, among the oldest figurative artworks ever created by a human being, and it was made by people who had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no domesticated animals, no writing, no metal tools, and none of the technologies that we typically associate with civilization. They were hunter-gatherers, moving across a landscape governed entirely by the seasonal availability of wild resources, and yet they had already developed the capacity, the motivation, and apparently the cultural infrastructure necessary to create representational art of considerable sophistication. This is not an isolated case. The cave art of Chauvet in France, depicting horses, lions, and rhinoceroses with a technical sophistication that startled the archaeologists who discovered it, has been dated to approximately 36,000 years ago. The Venus figurines, small carved representations of the female form found across a vast swath of Ice Age Europe, date to at least 35,000 years ago. Personal ornaments, including shell beads that show clear evidence of deliberate perforation and stringing, have been found at sites in Africa and the Middle East, dating back more than 100,000 years. Agriculture, by contrast, is a remarkably recent human innovation. The earliest clear evidence for the deliberate cultivation of plants dates to approximately 12,000 years ago in the region of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. This means that human beings were creating art in recognizable and often technically sophisticated forms for tens of thousands of years, and in some interpretations hundreds of thousands of years, before they developed agriculture. The gap between the emergence of art and the emergence of farming is not a matter of a few centuries. It spans the overwhelming majority of the period during which anatomically modern humans have existed as a species. This chronological fact, that art preceded agriculture by such an enormous margin, poses a genuine puzzle for any account of human development that assumes cultural sophistication follows in a straightforward line from economic security. If art requires leisure time, requires resources beyond bare subsistence, requires the kind of stability that only settled agricultural life can provide, then its appearance tens of thousands of years before agriculture is difficult to explain. Understanding why art came first requires abandoning some deeply ingrained assumptions about what art is for and what conditions are actually necessary to produce it. Let's begin with what the archaeological evidence reveals about the actual conditions under which the earliest human art was produced. The archaeologist Genevieve von Petzinger, who has conducted extensive comparative research on Ice Age cave art across Europe, has documented that early human art was not the product of a society with abundant surplus resources and ample leisure time in any straightforward economic sense. Hunter-gatherer societies, including those that produced the cave art of Chauvet and Lascaux, typically worked considerably fewer hours per week to meet their basic subsistence needs than agricultural societies that emerged much later, a finding first documented systematically by the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins in his influential concept of the original affluent society. Sahlins' research, based on ethnographic study of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, including the Jew hoansi of the Kalahari Desert, found that these societies typically spent between 15 and 20 hours per week on subsistence activities, considerably less than the working hours typical of agricultural or industrial societies, while enjoying diets that were often more varied and nutritionally adequate than those of early farming populations. This finding fundamentally overturns the assumption that hunter-gatherer life was a desperate, unrelenting struggle for survival that would have left no time or energy for artistic activity. If anything, Sahlins' research suggests the opposite relationship between subsistence strategy and available leisure time than the one most people intuitively assume. Hunter-gatherer societies may have had more discretionary time available for activities including art production than the agricultural societies that displaced them, because the transition to agriculture, contrary to popular assumption, generally increased rather than decreased the total labor required to sustain a given population, while simultaneously making that population more vulnerable to famine, disease, and the health consequences of a less varied diet. This reframing helps dissolve part of the apparent puzzle. Art did not require the leisure surplus that agriculture supposedly provided, because hunter-gatherer societies already possessed considerable discretionary time. But this still leaves the deeper question unanswered. Why did human beings use that discretionary time to produce art specifically, and what function did this art serve in societies that had no obvious economic need for it? The archaeologist Steven Mithen at the University of Reading, whose work on the evolution of music we examined in an earlier video in this series, has proposed in his broader research on the prehistory of the human mind that the emergence of representational art around 40,000 years ago reflects a fundamental cognitive transition, which he calls cognitive fluidity, the development of the capacity to combine information across previously separate cognitive domains, including social intelligence, natural history knowledge, and technical skill, into integrated forms of thought and expression that had not been possible in earlier hominin cognition. Mithen's argument is that earlier hominins, including archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, possessed sophisticated but largely separate cognitive modules: a social intelligence module for navigating relationships, a natural history intelligence module for understanding animals and plants, and a technical intelligence module for tool manufacture. The emergence of cognitive fluidity, on Mithen's account, allowed these previously separate systems to interact freely, producing exactly the kind of imaginative recombination that representational art requires. The capacity to represent an animal, not simply as a target for hunting, but as a symbol that can carry social and spiritual meaning, rendered using the technical skill of tool-making, applied to an entirely new purpose. The archaeologist and cognitive scientist Lambros Malafouris at the University of Oxford has developed a related but distinct account, emphasizing what he calls material engagement theory, the proposal that human cognition does not simply produce material culture as a downstream output of internal mental representations, but is itself constituted through ongoing physical interaction with material objects and the environment. On this account, the earliest cave paintings were not simply external expressions of ideas that already existed fully formed inside the minds of Ice Age artists. The act of painting, the physical engagement with pigment, rock surface, and the flickering light of a torch or fire in the depths of a cave, was itself a form of thinking, a cognitive process that unfolded through the physical act of creation rather than preceding it. The anthropologist David Lewis Williams at the University of the Witwatersrand has proposed one of the most influential and most contested accounts of the specific meaning and function of Ice Age cave art, arguing that the deepest and most inaccessible cave paintings, often located in chambers that required difficult and dangerous passage through narrow, dark, physically demanding cave systems, were created in the context of altered states of consciousness, potentially induced through prolonged sensory deprivation, rhythmic activity, or other techniques associated cross-culturally with shamanic practice. Lewis Williams's neuropsychological model draws on cross-cultural research, documenting that altered states of consciousness produce a specific and recurring set of visual phenomena, geometric patterns, tunnel-like visual experiences, and the sense of transformation into animal forms that appear with striking consistency across cultures and are grounded in the shared neurological structure of the human visual system. Lewis Williams argues that many of the specific motifs found in Ice Age cave art, including the geometric patterns that appear alongside representational animal images at many sites, correspond closely to the visual phenomena documented in altered states research, suggesting that at least some cave art may have been created in the context of ritual practices involving deliberately induced altered consciousness. This account, while contested in its specific details, connects to a broader body of evidence, suggesting that early human art was deeply embedded in ritual, religious, and cosmological practice, rather than being a form of pure aesthetic decoration, disconnected from spiritual or social meaning. The archaeologist Jean Clottes, who led the excavation team at the Chauvet cave, has documented that the placement of paintings within the cave system, often in the deepest, most difficult-to-access chambers rather than near cave entrances where they would have been easily visible in daily life, suggests that the act of creating and viewing this art was itself a significant ritual undertaking, requiring deliberate effort and likely restricted to specific individuals or occasions rather than being casual decoration. The evolutionary anthropologist Ellen Dissanayake, whose research on the evolutionary origins of music we also examined in an earlier video, has extended her broader theoretical framework to encompass the visual arts as well, proposing what she calls the making special hypothesis. Dissanayake argues that across all human cultures, art functions to take ordinary objects, actions, and experiences and transform them into something extraordinary, marked as different from mundane reality through deliberate aesthetic elaboration. This process of making special, Dissanayake proposes, serves crucial social and psychological functions. It marks significant events and objects as important, coordinates group attention and emotion around shared symbols and rituals, and reinforces the shared meanings and values that hold a social group together. On Dissanayake's account, art is not a luxury that emerged only once basic survival needs were comfortably met. It is a behavior that likely contributed directly to the survival and reproductive success of the groups that practiced it, by strengthening the social cohesion, shared identity, and coordinated ritual practice that made effective cooperation possible in the small, tightly bonded groups characteristic of Paleolithic human society. Art, on this account, was not a byproduct of surplus resources. It was one of the tools that helped produce the social cohesion, without which surviving in a harsh Ice Age environment would have been considerably more difficult. The archaeologist April Nowell at the University of Victoria has extended this analysis specifically to the question of what Ice Age art reveals about the cognitive and social lives of children in Paleolithic societies, documenting evidence that some of the handprints and finger markings found in cave art sites were made by children, suggesting that art production was not restricted to a specialized class of adult ritual specialists, but was, at least to some degree, a broader social practice in which multiple generations participated. This finding adds an additional dimension to the social cohesion account. If art production involved children as well as adults, it likely functioned partly as a mechanism of enculturation, transmitting shared symbols, stories, and cultural knowledge across generations in a society that had no writing system to preserve and transmit this information in any other durable form. This connects to a broader account of art as a technology of memory and cultural transmission. In a society without writing, the accumulated knowledge of the group, including practical knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and the location of resources, as well as social and cosmological knowledge about the group's origins, values, and relationship to the natural and spiritual world, had to be preserved and transmitted entirely through oral tradition, ritual practice, and material culture, including art. The elaborate animal imagery found in Ice Age cave art may have functioned, at least in part, as a form of externalized memory, encoding and preserving crucial practical and cultural knowledge in a durable physical form that could persist and be transmitted across generations far more reliably than purely oral transmission alone. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses the question of what specifically changed in the human lineage to make this explosion of artistic production possible, at a time roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, rather than earlier or later in human evolutionary history. The archaeologist Richard Klein at Stanford University has proposed what has become known as the human revolution hypothesis, arguing that the appearance of representational art, personal ornamentation, and other markers of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity around 50,000 years ago reflects a specific genetic or neurological change in the human brain, potentially connected to the emergence of fully modern language capacity, that occurred relatively suddenly and produced a rapid and dramatic transformation in human cognitive and cultural capability. Klein's hypothesis proposes that anatomically modern humans existed for tens of thousands of years before this cognitive transition, meaning that the physical anatomy of the modern human brain was in place well before the cultural capacities that we now regard as distinctively human fully emerged. This hypothesis has been significantly challenged by subsequent archaeological discoveries, particularly findings from African sites that push back the evidence for symbolic behavior considerably earlier than the European cave art that had previously anchored most discussions of the origins of art. The archaeologist Christopher Henshilwood at the University of Bergen has documented evidence of deliberate geometric engraving on pieces of ochre at Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to approximately 75,000 years ago, along with perforated shell beads showing clear evidence of intentional stringing and wear patterns consistent with having been worn as personal ornaments, from the same site and time period. Henshilwood's discoveries, along with similar findings from other African sites, have substantially undermined the human revolution hypothesis in its original form, suggesting instead that the cognitive and cultural capacities underlying symbolic behavior and artistic production emerged gradually over a much longer period, likely beginning in Africa considerably earlier than the sudden European cultural explosion that had previously seemed to mark the origin of human artistic capacity. This evidence supports what has come to be called the gradualist or African multi-regional model of the origins of behavioral modernity, in which the capacities underlying art and symbolic culture accumulated incrementally over tens of thousands of years across the African continent, rather than emerging suddenly through a single genetic or cognitive innovation. This revised chronology has important implications for understanding the relationship between art and other markers of what archaeologists consider symbolic behavior. The archaeologist Marian Vanhaeren at the University of Bordeaux has conducted extensive comparative research on personal ornamentation across early human sites in Africa and the Middle East, finding that the practice of deliberately modifying and wearing shell beads as personal ornaments appears at multiple geographically dispersed sites at broadly similar times, suggesting that this behavior may reflect a shared underlying cognitive capacity for symbolic communication that was present across dispersed human populations rather than a localized cultural innovation that spread from a single point of origin. Vanhaeren's research is particularly significant for understanding the social function of early art and ornamentation, because personal ornaments in particular serve an especially clear and testable social function. They communicate information about the identity, status, or group membership of the person wearing them to other observers. Unlike cave paintings, which may have served primarily ritual or cosmological functions accessible to relatively few individuals, personal ornaments would have been visible in ordinary daily social interaction, suggesting that at least some early symbolic behavior served the more mundane but socially crucial function of communicating identity and group affiliation within and between the small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands that characterized human social organization for the vast majority of our species' history. What emerges from this body of research is a picture of Paleolithic art not as a luxury that required agricultural surplus to become possible, but as one of the fundamental technologies through which early human societies achieved the social cohesion, cultural transmission, and shared meaning that made their survival possible in the first place. Art did not wait for civilization. Art was one of the tools that made civilization, eventually, achievable. There is one final dimension of this research worth examining, because it connects the deep prehistory of human art to the question of what happened when agriculture eventually did emerge, and whether the relationship between art and subsistence changed in the way that a simple economic account would predict. The archaeologist Ian Hodder, whose excavations at Çatalhöyük we examined in an earlier video in this series on the origins of homesickness and place attachment, has documented that the transition to settled agricultural life, rather than producing an explosion of artistic production as economic surplus theories might predict, was accompanied by significant continuity in the underlying symbolic and ritual practices that had characterized earlier hunter-gatherer societies. Hodder's excavations found that the elaborate wall paintings, plastered animal skulls, and symbolic architecture at Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest large agricultural settlements yet excavated, represent an intensification and elaboration of symbolic practices with clear roots in earlier Paleolithic traditions, rather than a fundamentally new phenomenon that emerged only once agricultural surplus became available. This continuity is significant because it suggests that the relationship between subsistence strategy and artistic production is considerably more complex than a simple story in which art becomes possible only once agriculture provides sufficient economic surplus to support specialized artisans and leisure time for aesthetic activity. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests that art and symbolic culture were already fully developed capacities, embedded in social and ritual life, well before agriculture emerged, and that the transition to agricultural life represented a change in the material and social context within which these already well-established capacities continued to be expressed, rather than the emergence of a genuinely new phenomenon. The archaeologist Brian Hayden at Simon Fraser University has proposed a related but distinct account connecting art, ritual feasting, and the eventual emergence of agriculture itself, arguing that competitive ritual feasting among ambitious individuals in complex hunter-gatherer societies, feasting that would have required elaborate material culture, including decorated vessels, ornamental display, and ritually significant art objects, may have provided one of the primary motivations driving the intensification of food production that eventually led to agriculture, rather than agriculture emerging as a simple response to population pressure or resource scarcity as earlier models had assumed. Hayden's account, while contested, offers a provocative reversal of the conventional narrative connecting art and agriculture. Rather than agriculture producing the surplus that made art possible, the desire to create ever more elaborate ritual and artistic displays, requiring ever greater quantities of food and materials for competitive feasting and ceremonial exchange, may have been one of the significant pressures that drove some hunter-gatherer societies toward the intensified and increasingly managed food production that eventually developed into full agricultural economies. On this account, the relationship runs in the opposite direction from what most people assume, not agriculture enabling art, but something like the social and ritual functions that art served, helping to motivate the developments that eventually produced agriculture. The warty pig painted in reddish pigment on a cave wall in Sulawesi more than 45,000 years ago was not made by people who had solved the problem of survival and had time left over for decoration. It was made by people for whom the act of making it was itself part of how they survived, a technology of memory, of meaning, of social bonding, and of ritual coordination that helped hold together the fragile, cooperative human groups on which everything else, eventually including agriculture itself, would come to depend. Art did not follow from civilization. Civilization followed from art. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.